It was a cold October evening, and the chill breeze gently whisked through the shadow-covered forest surrounding the small wooden house. It was, as I mentioned, small and unimpressive, made entirely of an aged gray wood with a dark shingled roof mounted atop a short, single-story affair. It was an old house, about 60 or 70 years old. No one really knew, to be honest, because it had been uninhabited for decades. The only reason it still stood now, prim and devoid of the overeager kudzu that shrouded the trees around it, it was because a desperate real estate agency had been trying to sell it for years, but no one wanted to live there. Locals said they had a bad feeling about this place. It was like something was always watching you. A few had claimed that, as they drove by, they had caught passing glimpses of a massive white animal, but many diminished these rumors as poor attempts to attract tourists. It probably was, at least, that was the opinion of the McGregor family, who had just finished moving in not 2 days ago. The McGregors had a normal move, and now that they were settled, things were calm and quiet. The kids had been put to bed, and after 2 hours of loud shouting and hectic sibling conflict, had finally gone to sleep. Now Mr. and Mrs. McGregor could finally just sit by the fire and enjoy the sounds of the woods around them. However, their plans were put on hold by a knock on the door. Outside, a figure was hunched over by the old wooden door, clutching the gnarled wooden cane with two wizened hands. Sighing, the McGregors stood and strode to the door, irritated by the disturbance. Opening the door, they gazed at the scarred face of an elderly man, the age of whom they couldn't even begin to guess. He gazed at them with a pair of dull, tired eyes and asked in an equally dull and tired voice if he could come in. Introduced himself as Mr. Jeremiah Halifax III. The McGregors shot each other a quick look and shrugged. Why not? What harm could it bring to them? They invited him in, and the older gentleman limped into their newly acquired home. Seeming as though he knew it by heart, the McGregors did not notice the plain mask which Mr. Halifax wore, and he quickly hid it as he sat himself in an old, well-made and polished rocking chair. He grasped his cane in both hands and apologized for his intrusion. Mr. McGregor waved it aside. Halifax nodded and explained why he had come. The McGregors were at risk, apparently, and Halifax immediately advised that they leave. Now, the McGregors shared another look, an exasperated one. They had heard the legends of the beast that was supposedly lurking around here and decided they were ridiculous, and they told Mr. Halifax so. Frowning, Halifax asked if they had heard what had happened to the last family that had stayed there. The McGregors looked at him with an amused expression and told him to go ahead, but that he shouldn't expect them to believe anything he had to say. Halifax shrugged and told him, "We will see."
They were a family of 5. I can't recall their names, so let's call them Jeffersons. Anyways, it was the 50s, it was a great time, there was a big economic boom, and they just bought themselves a house. This house, specifically. The father had just gotten a pay raise, and they decided to pack up their stuff and move out here. It was a quiet area, there weren't a lot of automobiles. Perfect place to raise a family. Anyways, they moved in pretty quickly, didn't have an awful lot to unpack. Their kids were just thrilled with the place, real pleased with the choice their parents had made. The whole family was excited about the future, the parents in particular. You should have seen the place back then. They just finished building it a month earlier. That night, Mr. Jefferson was out on the porch, sitting in his rocking chair, creaking back and forth as he smoked his cigar. The night was real quiet, which struck him as out of sorts. No crickets, no owls, no coyotes, nothing. Just him and the big quiet world. Then he saw something that chilled him to the bone, and he stood up quick as lightning, peering out into the shadows of the forest as he heard something crunching around the bushes. The moon, which had been covered by clouds just a few moments earlier, illuminated the source. What he saw made him shake. Rising out of the bushes was a set of long spines, 7 of them, like the fangs of some kind of demon looming out from the dark green. A large white shape slowly stomped through the foliage, and he heard something snarling and growling and screeching up a storm. Scared out of his wits, Jefferson just stood there and stared at it until the moon was blocked out by the clouds again, plunging the world in shadows. Jefferson couldn't see very well now, and his heart thumped faster as he heard the crunching a little closer, closer. He was about to shout and run back inside when the moon lit up the place again. There was nothing, just him and the big dark world. Jefferson sank back down into his chair and looked at the woods, but he didn't see anything, just the bushes. After a while, he convinced himself that all he'd seen were the bushes moving in the wind. The problem was, there was no wind, and the bushes were a good 2 feet shorter than what he'd originally seen. But that's just how people are. We get scared and we convince ourselves that we're being tricked by the light or by the wind. The thing is, oftentimes, we're the ones who are tricking ourselves. Well, a few days passed and everything returned to normal, though Jefferson kept his eye on the woods. As much as he thought that what he'd seen a few nights earlier was just a trick of the light, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being, well, hunted. He made sure he was always close to his kids as well, just to be sure, just to be safe. A few nights later, the Jefferson family was scattered through the house. Two of the kids in bed, one in the living room playing near the window, and the mother and the father in the bedroom. Mr. and Mrs. Jefferson were occupied in a conversation about what they should do as a family the next day when suddenly they heard a wild, blood-curdling scream from the living room. They bolted into the living room where, through the window, a dark shape watched, growling and snarling, its thick lips drawn back to reveal a number of long, sharp canines, curved like glittering white scimitars. A set of 5 glowing eyes fixed them in a cold, ravenous stare. The Jefferson parents were paralyzed by the sight of this thing that was so unlike anything they'd ever seen before. They stood behind their screaming child, staring as it put on its fearsome display. Finally, it let loose a high, horrible screech and disappeared in an instant from the window. The Jeffersons stared at the window for a long time after that, hearts pounding, mouths dry. The next morning, they phoned the authorities. The police conducted a thorough search of the woods late into the evening. They left before the sun completely set, though, themselves unnerved by the elongating shadows and the twisted, bare branches of the gray, emaciated trees. The whole forest looked like it was in agony. Unsurprisingly, they found nothing. It was remarkable that they had stayed for as long as they did. No one liked going in those woods, especially not at night. They said it made them feel unnerved, and they felt like they were being watched like a skinny wolf watches a fat sheep. Another few days passed, though it felt like years to the Jeffersons, who were always watching the woods around their house with rapt attention, like deer who'd heard a twig snap under a hunter's foot. Well, one day Mrs. Jefferson was out attending to the laundry that she had set out to dry earlier that morning. She was afraid, of course, a big 8-foot-long monster running through the woods around your house with those long fangs. Only a very brave person, or a very stupid one, wouldn't be afraid. No, I'm sorry, scratch that. Only a very, very stupid person would be afraid of that thing. Anyways, Mrs. Jefferson was just unclipping a shirt, her back tight with the expectation that a set of killer claws would break down her spine and gut her like a fish when the skin on her neck set to crawling with a nasty feeling, like she was being watched. She resisted the urge to turn around, chiding herself. You're just imagining things. You're just imagining things. You're just imagining things. However, she couldn't resist for long, and her head swiveled to regard the woods with a cold, searching stare. She saw it. It saw her. It snarled, flashing her a wolf's grin with its savage fangs. It raised its massive white paw, and it smashed it down into the ground, pulverizing a pile of long dead leaves. It screamed at her, and she reeled, swinging up her arms to cover her face. She expected a heavy weight to jump onto her, and the hot, vile breath of the thing to block out her senses, and it tore her into her with its long, curved fangs. But it didn't. Mrs. Jefferson nervously looked at it through her open arms. The beast screeched and took a step forwards, and she was back inside the house in a matter of seconds, yelling at the top of her lungs as she went. Slamming the door behind her, she slid down its length and sobbed. Her husband rushed in, and she stood, barely coherent, as she tried to describe what had just happened to her. However, Mr. Jefferson managed to glean enough from the broken dialogue that monster was back again and getting bolder, it looked like. Soon enough, it wouldn't just stand there and snarl. Sooner or later, it was going to get someone. Hurt them, kill them. 2 nights later, Mr. Jefferson woke up to the sound of a dull, quiet scratching coming from the back of the house. At first, he thought it might be a stray cat or something like that. However, a long series of dragging rasps made it sit up. Since when had he ever seen a stray cat around here? Angered, Mr. Jefferson got out of bed, scavenged a flashlight from the kitchen, put on his boots, and walked outside. He was done with this. He ran into the house, the bright beam from his flashlight illuminating the darkness. If anything, it just made the gaunt trees seem thinner, more lifeless. The scratching grew louder as he grew closer to the back. His foot snapped the twig in two, making him jump. The scratching abruptly ceased, and he heard something run into the woods through the leaves. Confused, Jefferson came to the back and flashed the light across the woods near it. Nothing. Turning, Jefferson stopped short. The sight that met his eyes chilled his blood to ice and made him give a short shout of surprise and fear. He ran back inside to get his wife. Jefferson and his wife came back out to the back of the house. Mrs. Jefferson, originally irritated and unwilling to go outside this time of night, stopped short in her berations of her husband and turned a very pale color, as if all the blood had been sucked out of her face. In 4 parallel lines, the words, "Get out," had been carved into the back of the house, the claw marks trailing down from the bottom of the sloppy tea. Blood marked the message scarlet, oozing blood.
Before the elderly man could continue his story, the McGregors stood up in unison, angered by what they considered to be a thinly veiled threat. They told the man to leave, their faces twisted with fury. The man stood, gripping his cane so tightly, his wrinkled knuckles were a pale white. He regarded the 2 angry parents with a saddened expression. He shrugged and shook his head slowly. Then he turned his head so that he could see the long, thick scar that marked on his head. "This is what that thing did to me," he said. "This is what it will do to you, if not worse." And with those final, ominous words, the old man turned and showed himself out, limping away into the night, which he had once so feared all these years ago when he had lived here. There was little left in his life. He felt no trepidation at the thought of what lurked in the woods. The McGregors watched him leave, heads together, as their equally disdainful eyes glared at the receding back. They didn't believe a word of this man's warning. Not the teeth, the claws, the eyes glowing in the woods, or the clawed message that had been supposedly engraved on the back of the house, even though its coat of paint was far newer than the paint anywhere else. However, their disregard for the man's story did not entirely block out their sense of curiosity and fear, just as tales of ghosts and demons have not entirely faded from the human mind. What if there was something in those woods, something as large, fierce, and cunning as the old man had testified? What if it was watching them, right there and then, waiting, patiently biding its time, curbing its urge to kill or hunt whatever its intentions were? No, this was ridiculous. There was no such thing as monsters, no such thing as ghosts, no such thing as demons. The only thing you had to fear in the world was fear itself. They found its first warning the day after the old man left. A week later, they abandoned the house, minus a child, whose body had been found, mostly.